Hi everyone, welcome to week 3. Um, Last week we talked about some of the characters and events that shaped Jane as a child and led to her arrival at Thornfield. This week, and pretty much for the next couple of volumes, Jane will be addressing many questions, but one of the guiding questions will be the question of marriage. Um, the word spinster is one that's often used to describe the Bronte sisters even today, but it's also one that has negative connotations. The OED defines the spinster as an unmarried woman, especially older, but there's a way in which this figure has kind of been mythologized. In Villette, Charlotte Bronte, one of her later novels, after her sisters and brother passed away, she said, "If I thought myself doomed to old maidenhood, I should cease to value my life. The thought of living on year after year at the Grove, hanger-on upon Mamma and Walter, is perfectly intolerable." Now, this is actually not the narrator who speaks this, who is an unmarried character for a large part of the novel. But there are all kinds of versions of femininity, including an older spinster whom the narrator reviles. In her book Spinster, which was published a few years ago, Kate Bollock describes the state of being single in the Victorian period this way. She says, "Being a wife and mother wasn't just plan A, it was the only plan. To live otherwise meant to live without a template, consigned to the margin, discouraged from seeking a new and different happiness." Jane Eyre lives in this world, but she also seems to have a sense in which singlehood can be a better option than to live for someone else. Edith Wharton says this about being single: "I believe I know the only cure, which is to make one's center of life inside of oneself, not selfishly or excludingly, but with a kind of unassailable serenity, to decorate one's inner house so richly that one is content there, glad to welcome anyone who wants to come and stay, but happy all the same when one is inevitably alone." This is the state in which Jane finds herself when she arrives at Thornfield. Enter Rochester, who, this is not even just an atypical love story, he is an atypical hero. Jane is the one to save Rochester multiple times, and in return, when he asks her, "Do you think me handsome?" she says, "No, sir." These are the types of atypical responses to love stories that have influenced contemporary love stories. We've seen it many times, the Austen, Darcy, Elizabeth love that begins with an aversion to each other. If you're looking for topics for your mini essays, you might start here with the strange scene in which Rochester dresses up as a gypsy to learn what Jane really thinks of him. But also it brings in the strange kind of otherworldly, supernatural state in which this novel stays quite often, particularly when it comes to the character of Bertha, who is at first introduced as a laugh, as a symbol, as something that is repressed, potentially ghostly, with an unknown source. Rochester's proposal also, like his scene in which he is cross-dressing as a gypsy, begins in trickery. And this is one of the first moments in which Jane stands up for herself, puts herself at the center of the novel, and rejects his pleas to be cruel. In this moment, she does acknowledge herself as poor, obscure, and plain, but she also recognizes that she and Rochester stand as equals in front of God. This isn't just man and woman. This is governess and boss. So this is a pretty powerful moment in the Victorian period, but I would think today as well, in terms of what Jane is actually doing here. Bertha's character has influenced books such as Mad Woman in the Attic, but also the idea that Jane is has a doppelganger. We see this in the red room where she's looking in the mirror. She sees this kind of elf-like, darker shadow self. The repressed version of these characters that is not permitted to have passions, to be improper, to speak willfully, as Jane often does, is symbolized in the figure of the madwoman in the attic. Bertha herself has no lines in this story, but her presence is given more attention in contemporary films than it was when she first appeared in the silent versions of Jane Eyre, in which sometimes her feet are only shown. She's referred to as a supernatural figure who does not speak, who has no agency, whom Rochester has treated almost as an animal. When she is revealed, she's described as insane, and yet the reader is left to wonder whether this is a cause of being imprisoned in the attic for all of these years. Jane herself wonders if the same fate could be hers if Rochester so chose it. One of the most powerful moments in the novel is when Rochester attempts unsuccessfully to persuade Jane to stay. And not just to stay, but to go with him as his mistress to the south of France. And she refuses when he says, quite ineffectively, that she has no one, that she should go with him because it is her only option. She says, I care for myself. The more solitary, the more friendless, the more unsustained I am, the more I will respect myself. So she does plant her foot in this moment, and it has reverberations of Helen Burns and her advice when Jane was humiliated at Lowood School. Another moment you might want to talk about is St. John's proposal, which is even probably more strange than Rochester's, and the fact that there's two strange proposals in one novel could make an interesting topic for a mini essay too. You could talk about your response to the argument that St. John is making here about duty and love, and Jane's reaction to it. You might also discuss the ways in which superstition affects characters in the novel, and particularly Jane. Just how heavily does she rely on these moments of kind of intrigue and mystery? How influential are they on her? Not just in the laugh, in Bertha's laugh, when she discovers it is actually a person, but that there are moments like this one where Jane is led to move and to act by a supernatural kind of intervention. A lightning struck tree. And this metaphor of Rochester as also a lightning struck tree is important because one question this novel asks is whether Rochester needs to be struck down, needs to be maimed in order to be equal to Jane. Also, is it important that Jane become an independent woman financially in order to declare, reader, I married him? These are questions you could explore in your mini essay, the ones that interest you most for this first assignment. But really, if there's a passage that stands out to you when you're reading as one that you really want to talk about, it's a good place to start. This last eulogy, Bronte's eulogy, calls attention to the intrigue that I talked about a little last week about the Bronte sisters, and the fact that not only Jane Eyre, but Wuthering Heights and all of the novels and poetry and literature that came out of this family who resided primarily on the moors of Haworth. And I've posted a link to a documentary or a film called To Walk Invisible, which takes a more realistic look at the Brontes, the lives they led, the literature they produced, and kind of chips away at the myth that this was some type of a miracle or an impossibility that such people could be so worldly without ever leaving Haworth. I'm looking forward to hearing all of your thoughts online in our discussion, and have a great week.